It was just after midnight in Burkina Faso. The land was quiet. The kind of quiet that holds memory, like an old hymn beneath the soil. Then came a sound. Not thunder, not wind, a buzz, steady, unnatural, uninvited. And just like that, the night was torn open. No warning, no sirens, only fire. Trucks overturned. Men trained in foreign academies fell before they could raise a weapon. In minutes, life was lost before a prayer could be spoken. And as smoke rose above the trees, one name echoed through the radio. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He had given the order. The world called it a strike. But in Africa, it felt like a sentence. A sentence long overdue. For decades, mercenaries moved like shadows through the continent, armed not just with rifles, but permission. That night, permission was revoked. So, the question is simple. Was this just another battle in the Sahel? Or was this the night Africa finally said, "No more. Stay with us," and see how God carries this story forward? Because this is not the story of one person or of one nation. It is the story of an entire continent reclaiming its voice. Subscribe and raise your voice for an Africa that stands tall and rise. The whispers began long before the fire. Weeks before the strike, the winds along Burkina Faso's southeastern border carried more than just dust. Traders crossing at twilight spoke of unmarked vehicles, black, windowless, silent, slipping past checkpoints without resistance. Farmers tending late fields noticed tracks where no roads had ever run. In Ouagadougou, beneath the hum of daily bustle, a different kind of buzz stirred. Intercepted calls leaping from tower to tower, encrypted, coded, foreign. And then came the line that silenced every room it touched. Operation Broken Spine begins in 72 hours. The target was no secret. Koudougou oil refinery, still under construction, barely operational, yet already sacred. It was the jewel of a new dream. To fuel Burkina Faso not with imports or donations, but from its own ground, with its own hands. To destroy it would mean more than physical loss. It would sever the hope of a nation. Captain Ibrahim Traoré summoned his inner circle just before dawn. There were no cameras, no podiums, just 5 officers, 2 lamps, and a wooden table spread with hand-drawn maps. He stood as they entered, already knowing the question none dared speak aloud. "If they reach the refinery?" asked his most senior aide. The answer came sharp and without drama. "We lose it," said another. "We lose the momentum. We lose the people's faith." Traoré didn't pace. He didn't frown. He simply leaned forward, calm, focused, and gave the order. Deploy the drone. Terminate the threat. It wasn't the first time he had given such a command. But this one felt different. Because this wasn't about rebels in the bush or insurgents in distant provinces. This was something else, more precise, more polished, and far more dangerous. The drone assigned was no ordinary tool of war. It wasn't French, American, or Chinese. It didn't come with a flag or a press release. Its name was NA-7, a quiet whisper among military circles. Built in secret by Burkinabe engineers, refined with the help of North Korean aerodynamic models and Russian targeting software, it was not born out of luxury, but necessity. It was lean, it was local, and it carried only one purpose: to end a threat before it reached the heart of the nation. At exactly 3:44 a.m., the command was confirmed. 12 minutes later, the sky above Koudougou flared orange. The convoy, 5 trucks, satellite-linked, carrying encrypted comms, long-range arms, and confidence bought with foreign cash, disintegrated before a single man could aim his weapon. The strike was surgical. No civilians, no collateral, just precision and silence. When the dust settled, the air was thick with more than smoke. It was thick with questions. Who were they? Who sent them? And why now? But Captain Ibrahim knew the answer before anyone said a word. They were not just here to destroy a refinery. They were here to remind Burkina Faso of its place. And he had reminded them, in fire, that the place they once knew no longer existed. By dawn, the sky was quiet again. But the ground still burned. Investigators arrived before the sun had fully risen. Ash floated like mist over the savannah. The convoy, once sleek and defiant, lay in pieces, metal twisted, wheels blackened, weapons scattered like bones. And what they found in that charred silence would rewrite everything. First came the weapons, not rusted Kalashnikovs or black market knockoffs. These were pristine, fresh from factory lines. M4 rifles still bearing American serial numbers. One, so advanced, held a biometric fingerprint lock. Tech only issued to elite hands. French-made radios hummed faint static, still linked to encrypted channels thousands of miles away. The bodies followed. These were not ragtag fighters. No teenagers with worn boots. No rebel flags. These were trained men, disciplined, silent, coordinated. Their uniforms were sterile, their muscles sculpted. Their formation, even in death, told of military choreography. And then came the fingerprints. Run through international databases, the results punched through every assumption. Nigerians. Not just any Nigerians, men once enrolled in special forces units. Men whose files had been wiped clean months earlier. Ghosts, reborn in the dark. Who erased their names? Who paid their salaries? Who told them where to strike? The questions echoed louder than the blast itself. And in the pocket of one fallen operative, the investigators found something small. A mobile phone, screen cracked, but still alive. It carried only one saved contact. DC Handler. That was the moment the silence broke. Because everyone knew what DC meant. This was no random raid. No tribal war. No freelance hit job. This was a proxy strike, cleanly orchestrated, meticulously funded, aimed not just at a refinery, but at the future of a rising nation. The money trail spoke volumes. Satellite intel traced transfers through offshore accounts in the Caribbean. Shell companies routed funds through Abu Dhabi, then London, then Paris. The speed of movement, faster than even the drones that now circled the skies. And in the middle of it all, one name repeated through intercepted calls. Falcon Hand. A code name, a whisper in military files. Always appearing when the fingerprints needed to be erased. Always connected to jobs that left no trails. Only flames. Traore's war council studied every detail. They saw the maps recovered from the ashes. Locations circled in red. Gold deposits. Lithium fields. Oil infrastructure. This wasn't an attack. It was a blueprint. A campaign? A message. But messages can be answered. And Captain Ibrahim did not flinch. He stood before his officers, voice level, eyes steady, and spoke 5 words that would carry across the continent. If they send ghosts, we send thunder. Outside, the skies still smoldered. But inside every heart that heard those words, something else burned. Conviction. Because the strike had not just destroyed the men on the ground. It had revealed the war behind the war. Fought not with tanks, but transactions. Not in uniforms, but in shadows. And if Africa was to survive, it could no longer wait to be rescued. It had to strike first. The morning after the drone strike, smoke curled high above the Kudugu horizon. But the real fire wasn't in the bush. It was in the hearts of the people. Word of the attack raced faster than radio. In Ouagadougou, it echoed through markets, mosques, schoolyards. But what emerged wasn't fear. It was fury. And beneath that fury, pride. Elders leaned on canes and whispered what they hadn't dared say in years. They tried to break us. Young men shouted back, "Not this time." What began as murmurs turned into marches. Thousands poured into the capital's streets, waving not only the red, green, and gold of Burkina Faso, but the banners of its Sahel siblings, Mali, Niger, and Guinea. Placards read, "Africa can no longer be bought. We are the shield. Burkina is awake. Who's next?" Women painted the face of Ibrahim Traoré on walls. Children sang his name in the streets. In homes where power cut out at night, families huddled by candlelight to replay the story again and again. Because for once, it wasn't tragedy. It was triumph. In Mali, students printed the satellite image of the destroyed convoy, stamping it with bold red text, "Do not touch sovereignty." In Nigeria, the reaction was more complex. Shock, rage, shame. For many Nigerians, the idea that former special forces, trained to protect their people, had become mercenaries in a foreign plot was devastating. Online, young Nigerians flooded forums with 3 words: "This is betrayal." But across Africa, one thing became clear. This was bigger than borders. And as the continent lit up with pride, the West scrambled to respond. In Washington, the White House released a 2-line statement. "We urge restraint. We call for stability in the Sahel." But the calmness of the words betrayed the chaos behind them. Because the Pentagon had seen the blast, but not the drone. No warning, no trace, no signature. In Paris, the reaction was sharper. The French foreign minister condemned the strike as reckless, claiming it risked destabilizing an already fragile region. Yet no explanation came for why French-made radios were found among the ashes. On CNN and BBC, the questions piled up. Is Traoré pushing Africa toward chaos? But inside African households, the question was far more powerful. Is this the leader who finally said enough? In NATO command rooms, analysts stayed up overnight studying the footage. The NA-7 drone, built without Western blueprints, had struck with precision unseen in the region. One observer reportedly muttered, "We don't have anything that clean in the field." And in Moscow? Silence. No confirmation. No denial. But Russian state media played the story on repeat, with one word beneath the footage: satisfaction. While politicians in the West argued over protocol, Africa was celebrating precedent. Because for the first time in modern memory, a small African nation had not waited for permission. It had acted. It had defended. It had declared, "Not on our land." And in doing so, it had sent a message louder than any speech. Sovereignty is not a request. It is a right, and it will be protected. The dust of Kudugu had barely settled when another storm began. This time, not of fire, but of unity. 3 days after the strike, in a quiet government hall in Ouagadougou, 3 flags stood side by side. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. No press, no preamble, only decision. Leaders from the Sahel states gathered behind closed doors. Not with advisors from Paris or envoys from Washington, but with one another. Because something had shifted. A line had been crossed. The result of that meeting would rewrite Africa's military map. Operation Iron Shield. A name forged not from symbolism, but survival. Their pledge was simple. If one of us is attacked, all will respond. No more isolated crises. No more quiet suffering. No more dying in silence. The command centers of Ouagadougou, Niamey, and Bamako were linked within hours. Encrypted networks now connected their intelligence streams. Burkinabe drones patrolled borders. Malian helicopters scanned the skies. Nigerian radar systems swept the edges of the Sahel, from gold fields to desert roads. It wasn't just technology. It was trust. It was the answer to a century of colonial fracture. This was not a peacekeeping mission. It was a pact, and others noticed. From Guinea to Chad to the Central African Republic, envoys began making quiet calls, asking a single question: can we join? For decades, Pan-African military unity had been a dream, often mocked, often sabotaged. Now it was here, real, breathing, watching. Western media called it reckless. Pentagon officials warned of dangerous escalation. French analysts labeled it a rogue coalition. But on the streets of Ouagadougou, the people called it something else: the first true shield. Murals appeared overnight. Traoré, Goïta of Mali, and Chiani of Niger standing in fatigues, not suits, with the words, "Not one step back." Old men who had lived through coups and colonization stood in awe. They had heard of revolutions before, but never unity. They had prayed for this. They just hadn't lived to see it. But now, their children would. Operation Iron Shield was more than military. It was memory and prophecy woven into steel. And though every shield invites a test, the message was clear. Africa had stopped waiting for help. It was building its own defense and daring the world to understand what that truly meant. The strike lasted 12 minutes, but its echo, that traveled far longer. In the weeks that followed, life in Burkina Faso returned to rhythm. The markets reopened. Schools rang with laughter. Construction on the Koudagou refinery resumed, this time with double the workers and none of the fear. But something had changed. Something no enemy could bomb, no sanction could undo. It was pride. In the countryside, old men who had once watched their land carved up by foreign contracts now stood tall. They weren't holding rifles. They were holding something deeper. The belief that their children might never have to kneel. In the cities, youth who had once dreamed of escape now dreamed of building. A new phrase appeared on walls and in whispers. This land is ours. And it wasn't just sentiment. Investors once dismissive of Burkina Faso now studied it with caution. Reports from London, Paris, and Washington shifted tone. Where they once spoke of instability, they now noted unprecedented defense capability. Because the NA-7 drone had done more than destroy a convoy. It had destroyed a myth, the myth that Africa must always be one step behind. Burkina Faso was no longer seen as a begging bowl. It was now a battleground of innovation. And it had drawn the line. Even in boardrooms, the tremors were felt. Oil interests paused. Mining operations reassessed their risk frameworks. Western executives asked hard questions they hadn't asked in decades. What if Africa doesn't want our help anymore? In Nigeria, the silence of President Tinubu's administration grew deafening. They could not confirm the presence of former special forces among the dead. They could not deny it either. To speak was to ignite scandal. To stay silent was to admit complicity. And within that vacuum, a new narrative emerged. One written not by diplomats, but by the people. In Bamako, murals of the NA-7 weren't weapons of war. They were shields, symbols, promises. Protect what is ours. We will not kneel again. In Ghana, university debates shifted from foreign investment to African autonomy. In South Africa, youth groups rewrote their manifestos, citing Burkina Faso as proof of concept. And in Ouagadougou, the streets spoke for themselves. Flags waved not just from poles, but from balconies, bicycles, fruit stands. Children who once wore cartoon characters on their shirts now wore their captain's face. And yet, beneath the chants, a quieter truth lingered. The war wasn't over, not even close. Every elder knew what history had taught. Power never retreats quietly. Interests do not die in silence. There would be another convoy, another attempt. Perhaps not with soldiers, but with sanctions. Not with drones, but with debt. But this time, Africa had heard its own voice. And once a people have heard their own power, it cannot be unheard. Captain Ibrahim Traoré knew this. He never celebrated publicly. He issued no victory speech. But every time he met with farmers, traders, youth leaders, his message was clear. The fire was only the beginning. So let me ask you, from wherever you sit, in Lagos or Atlanta, in Accra or Baltimore, do you believe this is the Africa our ancestors prayed for? If you do, say it. We are not here by accident. We are here by purpose. Say it with faith. Africa rise. Because in this new chapter, every voice becomes a brick in the wall of sovereignty. And every silent listener is one less soldier for the future. The night of the drone strike is already history. But its meaning, that still breathes. Because what began with a whisper from Captain Ibrahim Traoré has now become a roar across the continent. For decades, Africa was told that its destiny would be written elsewhere. In Paris boardrooms, in Washington war rooms, in London stock exchanges. But now, as the dust clears, one truth stands like a monument. Africa is ready to write its own story. This is not just Burkina Faso news. This is not just Captain Ibrahim's latest news. This is the sound of sovereignty, rising from the ashes of silence. This is the fire of a people who will no longer wait for permission. To defend, to build, to believe. And yes, they will come again. With new tools, new tricks. But Africa is no longer blinking. It is no longer begging. It is standing. So I ask you now, watching, remembering, hoping. Was this just another battle in the Sahel? Or was this the night Africa finally said, no more? Are you ready to speak up when silence feels safer? To stand tall when it's easier to bow? Every comment is a reminder that we're still here, that justice still stands, and it cannot be erased. Because Africa is not just catching up. We are building our own systems from the smallest acts on our own terms. Thank you for standing with us here. We'll see you in the next chapter. A chapter they wanted hidden, but we will never let that happen.